So if you don't know, Tubi is a completely free streaming service that currently has some of the best movies you can stream across any platform, anywhere. If you give me 20 minutes in this video, I'm gonna get you excited about a handful of movies that you've either never seen before or ones that you have. Much more excited than if you spent the same 20 minutes just browsing for something to watch. It's worth noting that Tubi does have ad breaks, that's why it's free, but not only do I find them to be fewer and farther between than most free streaming services, they also have this killer movie selection, starting with my number 20 pick, Queen of the Damned. Now, this is the weakest movie on this list, but I think it speaks a little bit to how killer this list actually is. This is based on the writings of Anne Rice. It's basically a sequel to Interview with the Vampire, or at least the book it is based on was part of the same series. You follow the vampire Lestat, who was played by Tom Cruise in Interview with the Vampire, but here he becomes a famous musician, and what's so cool about Queen of the Damned is the soundtrack. I do have another movie on this list with an even more killer soundtrack, but the Queen of the Damned soundtrack features the Deftones, Marilyn Manson, Static X, Tricky, and a bunch more. It's also a major role for Aaliyah. This was right before she died. This was actually considered her kind of breaking into the movie industry, and she does a killer job as well. If you're not into vampires or the soundtrack on this one, I don't know that there's enough for you to really grab onto though. But my number 19 pick is much more broadly appealing, surprisingly so. In fact, this is kind of like a Lifetime original movie, and trust me, if that turns you off, you don't want to watch a movie like that, A Simple Favor is like the best one that's ever been made. This is actually a really fantastic production with a lot of crisp twists and turns in it, but the basic setup does feel very much like something from the Lifetime channel. Blake Lively and Anna Kendrick really elevate this thing and make it pretty robust. It's got a little bit of a Hitchcock element, and even though it does deal with some heavy themes, it does keep things fairly light, making it much more broadly accessible than you might have imagined. Okay, my next pick is a cult classic sci-fi horror movie. Yes, it stars Vin Diesel, but it might be one of his most enduring movies, Pitch Black.
All you people are so scared of me. But it ain't me you gotta worry about now.
Now, in this movie, he plays Riddick, which he would go on to do in some other movies. Even though I liked one of those, I still do think Pitch Black is the gem in that series. While it does focus on his Riddick character quite a bit, you do spend a lot of time with the other characters in a fairly simple setup. They're marooned on an alien planet, and when it gets dark, ravenous man-eating creatures are all over the place. This movie has an incredible visual style, and most of the visual effects still hold up today. If you used to like this one and it's been a while since you've seen it, I guarantee you Pitch Black does hold up. Now, I mentioned there's another movie on this list with a killer soundtrack. My next pick features tracks from Sammy Hagar, Blue Oyster Cult, Black Sabbath, Cheap Trick, Journey, Grand Funk Railroad, Stevie Nicks, and a bunch more, all featured in heavy metal.
Heavy metal, a step beyond science fiction.
Released in 1981, Heavy Metal is an adult animated movie that is bonkers, to say the least. Not only does it have that killer soundtrack, but all of those tracks are set to incredible animated visuals like these. Yes, it's 1981, so the animation style is a little bit jerky, but if you can get past that, there are some really cool visuals in this movie. It's also pretty violent and fairly erotic at times, which is where that hard R rating comes in, but this is just really cool, especially if you dig the music. This was definitely the type of thing designed for people to get high and go to the movie theater in 1981. I'm sure that's what most people did. And then this thing sort of languished for like 10 years. It was hard to get all the rights from all those musicians to be able to put this on like a VHS. So if you missed it in the theaters in the 80s, there was a very good chance you never got a chance to see this. It's free on Tubi right now, and it is totally badass. Another badass movie from easily one of the most badass directors in movie-making history is Domino, directed by Tony Scott.
Okay, Domino, you're with me on the side. Choco, you cover the rear.
Now, this is not his best movie. He's famous for some really great movies like Top Gun, Crimson Tide, and True Romance. But Domino is definitely one of his more unhinged movies. Not only is the story fast-paced, but the editing style is very frenetic and fast-paced, almost too much so for some viewers. I happen to love the aesthetic of this movie. Keira Knightley is smoking hot. Mickey Rourke has a fantastic role. Believe it or not, I'm not always a fan of what he does in movies. I love him in this one. Tom Waits has a cameo. There's this whole weird Jerry Springer thing that actually doesn't fit in with the movie very well at all, but it's there. It's just a wild movie. It is glued together fairly well. It's not just total chaos, but it's pretty damn close, which is why it's so far back, despite the fact that I absolutely love this thing. My next pick is another banger from the 80s. It comes from 1984, the year I was born, and it is the original Red Dawn. Now, the remake with Chris Hemsworth has been available on streaming services all over the place because nobody really cares to see it. The original, though, is another movie from the 80s that still holds up incredibly well. Not only do the themes still hold up today, but the production design on this is pretty fantastic, and for something that's almost 40 years old, I think you'll be surprised at how good this movie still looks today. And it's from writer-director John Milius, who has created some of the most manly movies of all time. Movies like Jeremiah Johnson, Apocalypse Now, and Conan the Barbarian. So this movie does have that Milius juice in it that is just fantastic. Another one, if it's been a while since you've seen it, definitely check it out. You'll be surprised how well it holds up. Now, my next pick on this list has very similar themes to Red Dawn, except it takes place during the American Revolution. The Patriot.
Before this war's over, I'm going to kill you.
Why wait?
Now, Mel Gibson has starred and directed some of the best historical dramas of all time. While The Patriot doesn't really fit into that category, I do think it's pretty damn close. They take quite a bit of liberties, and it does get a little long in the tooth, but for the most part, this is a really solid film. And there are really only a handful of good movies that take place during the Revolutionary War, and in that category, The Patriot is easily one of the best. Denzel Washington makes this list with kind of a long-forgotten gem of his from the late 90s, Fallen.
Time is on my side. Yes, it is.
Now, this is the only horror movie that Denzel Washington has ever starred in, and it came out just a few years after David Fincher's Seven, a movie Denzel Washington was lined up to star in. He decided it was too dark, severely regretted that decision when the movie came out because of how good it was, and it looks like he maybe took a cue to do something a little dark afterwards. While Fallen is not nearly as good of a movie as Seven, it is pretty solid, especially in its genre. Similar to Seven, Denzel Washington plays a homicide detective investigating a series of bizarre murders. However, instead of just an unhinged Kevin Spacey, he's dealing with something much more supernatural. There's actually a demon that is able to jump from body to body, and the movie does convey that in a pretty convincing way. John Goodman also has a fantastic role in this movie. It's short and sweet, but it's really great. If you've never seen this one and you like dark, creepy stuff, it is really well put together and it's got a very clever premise that's pretty well delivered. Okay, my next pick I think will illustrate how strong of a list this actually is. This is a sci-fi movie that's less than 10 years old, and it happens to be one of my favorite time travel movies to have come out this century so far, Looper. And even though Bruce Willis kind of went off the rails at the end of his career and did a bunch of really terrible movies, this is easily one of the best that he's done this late in his career. Joseph Gordon-Levitt is fantastic in this movie, and if you're not familiar with it, he plays the younger version of Bruce Willis. There is an incredibly clever time travel element that's very different from anything I've seen in any other time travel movies here, and that's why Joseph Gordon-Levitt does not look like himself. He is a young Bruce Willis. They did a fantastic job. He looks like he could be the same person, even though he doesn't look the way Bruce Willis looked when he was young. This movie's got a fantastic sort of drab aesthetic, yet it works really well. It looks like you're in a real place. The timeline and everything is very convincing, and the advancement of technology here is pretty convincing as well. It's odd, it's weird, yet it does somehow still manage to feel pretty grounded. Now, if you've seen The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent starring Nicolas Cage, odds are when it was over, you got a hankering to see Paddington 2. A reference only people that saw that movie will get, but if you did get a hankering to see Paddington 2, it's free to watch on Tubi right now. And what's so funny about that joke in The Unbearable Weight is that Paddington 2 is actually a fantastic movie, especially in its genre. It almost looks like something directed by Wes Anderson at times. There are incredible performances from some of my favorite character actors in this movie, and a genuinely good story. It's interesting to follow, kids can follow it, it's got a nice message, it is such a well-rounded family movie, it really is rare. If you saw the original Paddington, I think that movie is fine. It's a fantastic family-friendly movie. Paddington 2, I promise you, is on another level. Now, before moving on with the rest of the movies on this list, I do want to tell you about today's sponsor, AG1 by Athletic Greens, which is a product I've been consuming on a daily basis for almost a year now, and I absolutely love it. But AG1 is an incredibly convenient powder that you mix into an 8-ounce glass of water, and it is absolutely packed with vitamins, minerals, probiotics, and adaptogens. I'm almost 40, and I'm in way better shape now than I was in high school. I mean, I literally watch movies for a living, so I need to proactively stay active, and AG1 helps me consume all of the benefits I would get from a leafy green diet without having to eat gobs and gobs of spinach and other greens. And beyond that, AG1 helps support a healthy immune system, and if you hadn't been paying attention the last couple of years, now's the time to have a very healthy immune system. But speaking of your immune system, if you use my link to order AG1, you're also going to get a free gift that's going to be a year's supply of vitamin D3 and K2, which again will further support that strong immune system that you definitely want to have right now. But when you order, this is what you get: the big bag of AG1, the bottle to drink it out of, a nice metal container to store it in the fridge, the scoop, all top quality stuff. And my viewers also get that free year supply of vitamin D3 and K2, plus 5 additional travel packs of AG1. So if you want to start introducing AG1 into your diet, definitely check out my link in the video description below. The free gift is a fantastic deal, and this is fantastic stuff. But speaking of fantastic stuff, let's talk about the rest of the movies on this list. Now, my favorite moments in Paddington 2 are definitely all of the prison sequences, but one of my favorite prison movies of all time is actually Cool Hand Luke.
Nobody can eat 58.
You just said he could eat anything.
You ever eat 58?
Nobody ever eat 50 eggs.
Released in 1967, this is easily my favorite Paul Newman movie, and I love Paul Newman, but he is quintessential Paul Newman in Cool Hand Luke, or at least this is how I see him. Not only is he great, but there's a bunch of fantastic character actors in this as well that are all doing killer work. And what's so great about Cool Hand Luke is there's not much of a plot. You're following this man who's thrown into this fairly barbaric southern prison, and he basically refuses to conform. Stunning cinematography, especially for the time, some really killer cinematography, and it's been remastered and updated. It looks great today. It does not look like a movie from the 60s. If you've never seen it, I highly recommend it, but even if you've seen it and it's been a while, it's another one. I promise you, you've forgotten how good Cool Hand Luke actually is. But if that's not for you, you like the hero of your film to be the ultimate authority figure, then ROBOCOP is also included on Tubi right now.
I'd buy that for $1.
Now, even though there have been a bunch of sequels and there's even a new video game actually coming out based on ROBOCOP, the first one, the original, still holds up and is far and away the best of the entire series. This is actually directed by Paul Verhoeven, who also did Total Recall with Schwarzenegger and, oddly enough, Showgirls. But ROBOCOP is one of the greatest satires of its kind. It oozes satire in every single sequence, and it's just done in a beautiful way. There's a lot of wacky, wild stuff in this movie that manages to work, and then there's over-the-top graphic violence that also works for the theme of ROBOCOP. Yes, it's gratuitous, but it's gratuitous because that's the type of movie that this is, and it helps actually serve the themes and the story pretty well here. I would actually consider this to be one of Paul Verhoeven's most successful movies. Not just in terms of box office, but in terms of how successful the messaging is. He always kind of reaches for the brass ring, and when it comes to ROBOCOP, I think he actually got it. Now, my next pick is largely considered by a lot of movie buffs to be one of, if not the greatest sci-fi movie of all time. And I agree with that sentiment in a lot of different ways. But this movie is also kind of a bear to watch, which is why I have it ranked in the number 8 spot. I'm talking about 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, I know some of you watching are in awe of how I could rank it so low, and others are in awe as to how this even made the list. So, let me explain. One of Stanley Kubrick's goals as a filmmaker was to break the format of movies. That's why this movie and some of his others have a strange structure and pace to him. He's not a fan of a typical sort of popcorn movie pace, and 2001 really kind of pushes against that at every single moment. This movie really is an exercise in patience. However, if you haven't, there is payoff after payoff, starting with the beginning of the movie. As soon as they introduce space travel into the timeline, not only is its introduction dramatic and really heavy, but all of the footage that you see of space travel is absolutely stunning today in 2022. I promise you, this stuff still looks incredible. And with regard to all of the space travel shots, the exterior shots, even the interior ones, it is very important to know that all of this was done almost an entire decade before Star Wars. I mean, really, the visuals in this were unlike anything anyone had ever seen in a theater before its release, and it's very rare to see anything as dazzling as this in movies today. This movie was so far ahead in terms of the technology developed to create it, but also far ahead in terms of the type of story it was telling. I mean, in this movie, they show you caveman leaping to space travel in the blink of an eye. They show you AI gone awry, a theme that is all over the place today. This was 1967, and then they show you what might happen at the farthest reaches of space, where we go beyond any sort of comprehension. It really is a magic trick of a movie that I do think all movie buffs embrace. If you've never wrapped your head around this one, hopefully my description helped a little bit. Now, my next pick is a very manly movie, but it is from a female director, Catherine Bigelow, the same woman who directed Point Break. I'm talking about The Hurt Locker.
How many bombs have you disarmed?
I'm not quite sure.
Sergeant.
Yes.
Ask your question.
873.
800!
Now, back in 2008, this was nominated for a bunch of Academy Awards and won for Best Picture. This is a solid movie that still holds up today, and I promise you, there are several sequences in this movie that you've forgotten about. What I like so much about The Hurt Locker, though, is it seems like something you've seen before, yet it takes a very different approach, especially when it comes to Jeremy Renner's character. The way that he goes about his job and the way that he enjoys it and wants to stay in it is very different from your typical leading man, sort of the reluctant leading man that gets thrown into action. This is almost the opposite. This is someone who has become addicted to this type of work, and you get to see how that plays out in this movie, and it doesn't follow your typical ebb and flow with the hero and villain. And again, there are several sequences in this movie that are incredibly intense, very well directed, perfectly acted, and all of that is on top of a killer script that, again, deals with themes in a way that's very different from what you normally get in war movies or other movies like this one, which, again, just always is going to earn it big points from me. Now, my number 6 pick actually got ranked on a list of the most rewatchable movies from the past 10 years, a video I just recently released, Whiplash. Now, if you didn't enjoy this one, hear me out, because this one is not only expertly directed by a first-time director, mind you, but the story moves again in a very different pace with very different ebbs and flows than movies like this typically have, which keeps me glued into them. I mean, coming from someone who literally watches thousands of movies, when something stands out as being unique, different, and kind of special, I Notice and Whiplash is definitely another one of those movies. Not only is Miles Teller great, but J.K. Simmons gives the performance of his career. I mean, I like him. He does great stuff. I don't know that he will ever be given a role that is going to be able to top this one. It really is dynamite stuff. And the movie itself has so many fantastic lines and scenes, and they're all compressed together in this fantastic narrative. There are a couple of what you might call dull moments, but for the most part, this thing moves and is just a top-notch film in my opinion. I say that to take us to one of the most classic comedies ever made. This too has an absolutely killer soundtrack with people like Ray Charles, James Brown, and Aretha Franklin in the Blues Brothers.
It's 106 miles to Chicago. We got a full tank of gas, half a pack of cigarettes. It's dark, and we're wearing sunglasses. Hit it.
Now, in terms of movies I love, this is the only one that's kind of close to a musical. There are so many fantastic musical numbers in the Blues Brothers, but the comedy in this movie is unparalleled, or at least it is today. There were a handful of movies around this era that are just still classics today, movies like Caddyshack and Animal House. But the Blues Brothers is directed in a way that is better than those, I think. It's got incredible cinematography for a comedy from 1980. I mean, really top-notch stuff. This is directed by John Landis, who did a bunch of great movies. Movies that people might even rank higher than this one. But The Blues Brothers is a good film from moment to moment, yet it's Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi being absolute madmen. And then let's not forget how many cars they wreck towards the end of this movie. It's all done basically as one joke, and it just keeps mounting. I mean, there are over 100 cars destroyed in the climax of this movie. It's absolutely hilarious, and it never gets old no matter how many times I see it.
You're women. I want to buy your women, the little girl, your daughters. Sell them to me. Sell me your children.
My next pick is another gem from a similar era in 1982. It happens to be one of my favorite, and I mean absolute favorite, horror movies of all time, Poltergeist. Now, I would never really put Poltergeist into the scariest horror movie category, but it does have some pretty terrifying moments in it. Visually, though, this is one of the most stunning horror movies ever made, and that statement still holds up today. This is an incredible movie with gobs and gobs of practical effects that, again, still look fantastic today. Something else I love about Poltergeist is that it's directed by Tobe Hooper. A lot of people think Spielberg did this movie. He produced it. Tobe Hooper is most famous for having directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. These two movies are almost polar opposite. Whereas the Chainsaw Massacre has really nothing supernatural, it's dirty, it's grungy, it's terrifying. Poltergeist is all supernatural, and it's glossy and polished and beautiful. I love the way that he handled both of these movies. They're both real horror masterpieces. Another one, if it's been a while, there are so many sequences in this movie you have probably forgotten about. It will be a wild ride, even if you feel like you're intimately familiar with it. And then my next pick is actually two movies, because I like to give you bonus stuff from time to time. It's actually Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049. Now, Blade Runner 2049 is a beautiful movie. I absolutely love it. I think it is a near perfect sequel to the original. I don't really have a bad word to say about it. I highly recommend it. However, let's focus on the original Blade Runner, which is another movie that was incredibly far ahead of its time. Released in 1982, Blade Runner took audiences to a world that was only ever seen in books before. I mean, yes, there were Star Wars and some really fantastic sci-fi movies that preceded this, but this dense, rich cyberpunk world that Ridley Scott transports you to in Blade Runner was unparalleled at the time, and honestly is kind of a rare thing to find today. Now, very much like 2001, it does have a very slow pace. There's actually not a lot that happens in this movie. There's a full plot and everything, but you can explain it in about 2 minutes. Most of it is just a journey into this 2019 cyberpunk Los Angeles, which is just an incredible place. And not just conceptually, right? Like, the idea of it is beautiful, but the way it was actually brought to screen Ridley Scott nailed it. I mean, the only real problem with Blade Runner is that modern day audiences tend to find it too slow. So for younger viewers, it's kind of harder to get into it, mainly because modern day movies have just fried your taste buds for good cinema. It is important when watching a movie like Blade Runner that you're observing the craft and the visuals that they've presented in front of you just as much as you're trying to follow the story. My number 2 pick is another visually stunning movie. It too is a war movie that is very different from a lot of others and is largely considered by a lot of movie buffs to be one of the greatest movies ever made. Apocalypse Now.
Terminate with extreme prejudice.
Now, Apocalypse Now Redux is the version on Tubi right now, and I do recommend that version mainly because it has been remastered and it looks incredible. I mean, it looks like it just came out yesterday. It looks like it was filmed yesterday. It is a beautiful movie with, again, just incredible cinematography. I've mentioned that word several times on this list. Apocalypse Now rivals everything that I've mentioned so far in terms of its visual style. It really is incredible and stands out on its own. And even though a lot of the themes are kind of vague and hard to grasp as you go on this journey up the river, they all become clear at the end. And to me, especially the first time I watched this movie, they're all pretty damn profound. Now, the Redux version does have some added scenes, some things that I don't think really elevate it too much. They end up making the movie a little bit too long, but it is a fair trade to have some of these stunning visuals. If you've never seen Apocalypse Now and you generally like my recommendations, make it the first thing you watch off of this list. But if you've seen it and don't really agree with the way I'm describing it, rewatch this version, give it a solid 30 minutes, and if you're not amazed by it, then I don't know, maybe you'll find my number 1 pick better. Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood makes the list with what I think is his greatest movie of all time. Not just the greatest one he's ever directed, and he is a fantastic director and directed the hell out of Unforgiven, but I'd also consider this to be the best movie that he's in, and he's in some bangers.
You just shot an unarmed man.
Well, he should have armed himself. He's gonna decorate his saloon with my friend.
The reason I think Unforgiven is specifically better than so many of the incredibly classic westerns Clint Eastwood has starred in is because it is also a commentary on those westerns. And it deals with a lot of the themes from classic westerns in a very different way. There's a lot of guilt that comes along with killing in this movie, something that you don't often see in westerns, but it's also just a top-notch western with incredible performances from Clint Eastwood. But you've also got Morgan Freeman and Gene Hackman killing it in this movie. If you've never seen it, it comes highly recommended from me, and I rarely recommend this movie on the channel because I rarely see it available on streaming, but it's included on Tubi right now. The full list of all the movies I've discussed here can be found in the top pinned comment down below, but I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this Tubi episode, and you will see me on the next one.